Statement by Nicola Sturgeon. On the conclusion of judicial review, the First Minister will take questions at the end of her statement, so there should be no interventions or interruptions. I call on Nicola Sturgeon. First Minister, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On the 16th and 24th of January 2018, the Scottish Government received 2 formal complaints of alleged misconduct by Alex Salmond during his time as First Minister. Those complaints came from 2 separate individuals. The complaints were investigated under the Procedure for Handling of Complaints Involving Current or Former Ministers, which I will refer to from here on as the procedure. As members are aware, that procedure was signed off by me and came into force in December 2017. As part of that procedure, I formally delegated responsibility for investigating complaints of this nature to the Permanent Secretary. The new procedure formed part of a wider review of Scottish Government policies and processes for addressing inappropriate conduct that the Permanent Secretary was asked by the Cabinet to undertake in the wake of the Me Too allegations. That review, of course, was confirmed to Parliament by John Swinney on the 31st of October 2017. In August 2018, following the conclusion of the investigation into the complaint raised about his conduct, Alex Salmond sought a judicial review of the procedure and the way in which it had been applied to him. This morning, the Court of Session accepted a joint minute from the Scottish Government and Alex Salmond settling the action for judicial review. The Permanent Secretary issued a statement earlier today detailing the reason for the decision to settle this case, and I think it's also appropriate for these matters to be set out, at least in summary, to Parliament. Therefore, as far as I am able, in light of the terms of the settlement and perhaps more importantly the ongoing police investigation, I will seek to provide Parliament in this statement and in the questions to follow with as much detail as I can. The decision to settle the case was taken by the Permanent Secretary with my support when it became clear that in one procedural respect only, albeit an important one, the application of the procedure could be perceived to have been flawed. In November 2018, Mr Salmond adjusted his petition for judicial review to advance a ground of challenge based on interaction between the complainants and the person who was subsequently appointed as investigating officer before the complaints were formalised. In late December 2018, the work being undertaken to produce relevant documents to the court in advance of the full hearing that was scheduled for next week led the government to reassess its position in relation to that ground of challenge in light of the full picture which was then available. After reassessing all the materials available, the Permanent Secretary concluded that an impression of partiality could have been created based on one specific point: contact between the person appointed as investigating officer and the 2 complainants in advance of and around the time of their complaints being formalised in January 2018. This prior contact was in the form of welfare support and guidance, which was provided to the women making complaints. And I think it is important to stress, Presiding Officer, that this support and guidance was in itself entirely legitimate and indeed entirely appropriate. As was set out in the Court of Session this morning, the Government does not accept claims that this was in any way encouraging the complaints, nor is there any suggestion that the investigating officer did in fact act in a partial way, or that either the investigation or the decisions reached were in fact partial. The Scottish Government is also confident that in all other respects the procedure which was followed was fair to all concerned. However, as members will be aware, it is a well-established principle that a process such as this must not just be impartial in fact, it must also be seen to be so. It is on that basis that the Permanent Secretary decided to settle the case and to agree that the decisions she reached about the complaints at the conclusion of the investigation should, on that ground alone, be set aside. It is important to note, as a simple matter of fact, that today's settlement has no implications one way or the other for the substance of the complaints or for the credibility of the complainants. The judicial review was never about the substance of the complaints, it was about the process of investigating those complaints. It will be open to the Scottish Government to reinvestigate these complaints, subject, of course, to the views of the complainants. But for reasons that I'm sure the Chamber will understand, this will be considered only when the ongoing police investigation has concluded. Presiding Officer, it remains my view that the Government was right to begin an investigation when serious complaints were made and not allow them to be swept under the carpet because of the identity of the person complained about. And while in this one respect the operational application of the procedure was flawed, the Scottish Government considers the procedure itself to be robust and it does remain in place. However, the Permanent Secretary has rightly instructed a review of the procedure's application in relation to the specific point which has arisen in order to ensure that employees can have confidence in the process that will be applied should there be a need in future to investigate complaints about ministers or former ministers. There is one final point about the process that I wish to make in light of today's developments. The Government has not at any time made public either the outcome of the investigation or the substance of the complaints, and that will remain the case. As I have already briefly mentioned, and members will appreciate, there is an ongoing police investigation that must be allowed to take its proper course. The Government could also, as I have just observed, reinvestigate these complaints in due course. So in these circumstances, it would not be appropriate for me or anyone else for that matter to say anything at this stage about the substance of the complaints. Presiding Officer, questions have also been raised in the past about meetings I had with Alex Salmond during the investigation, and so I want to address that issue now. I met with him on 3 occasions: on the 2nd of April last year at my home in Glasgow, on the 7th of June in Aberdeen ahead of the SNP conference, and at my home on the 14th of July. I also spoke with him on the telephone on the 23rd of April and the 18th of July. I have not spoken to Alex Salmond since the 18th of July. On the 2nd of April, he informed me about the complaints against him, which, of course, in line with the procedure, the Permanent Secretary had not done, and he set out his various concerns about the process. In the other contacts, he reiterated his concerns about the process and told me about proposals he was making to the Scottish Government for mediation and arbitration. However, I was always clear that I had no role in the process and I did not seek to intervene in it at any stage, nor indeed did I feel under any pressure to do so. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, it is deeply regrettable, perhaps that is an understatement, that as a result of a failure in the proper application of one aspect of the procedure, the Scottish Government has had to settle this matter today. The Permanent Secretary has already this morning apologised to all involved. In echoing that, I want to express my regret in particular for the difficult position that the complainants have been placed in. I know the Permanent Secretary has spoken directly to both women. I can only imagine how difficult the decision to raise concerns, as well as the publicity around this investigation and the judicial review, must have been for them in recent months. They had every right to expect the process to be robust and beyond reproach in every aspect of it, and to reach a lasting conclusion. And I am sorry that on this occasion that has not been the case. It is fair to say that in recent months all organisations have grappled with the challenge of ensuring fair and robust processes for the investigation of complaints, which can sometimes be historic in nature. It is because I personally take that task so seriously, that the Scottish Government is determined to learn and apply lessons from this case, so that any member of staff raising complaints in future can have confidence that every aspect of the process applied will be robust. Ensuring a robust complaints process is part of the responsibility of every organisation to provide a safe and respectful working environment. And I, as First Minister, am determined that the Scottish Government will live up to that responsibility.
Thank you.
I think it is absolutely essential that we keep the interests of complainants at the heart of this. the Scottish Government took steps, as did many other organisations, to put in place a procedure for dealing with complaints of harassment, including complaints of sexual harassment. That procedure, in my view, is robust and remains in place. In one aspect of the application of that procedure, the Scottish Government processes have fallen short, and I deeply regret that, and that is something the Scottish Government has to reflect seriously on, and that is something the Scottish Government has got to be determined to learn lessons about. In terms of, Jason Carlow quoted something I said. I won't quote it back because I don't have the exact terms, but to the effect that I was satisfied with the actions that the SNP, I and the Scottish Government had taken. This is an investigation that has nothing to do with the SNP, so I'll refer to myself and to the Scottish Government. At that point, I believed that was the case. And today, with the exception of the one aspect that the Government has conceded was flawed, I still believe that all of the aspects of the application of the procedure by the Government was fair and robust. Now, that is no comfort to anybody because that one flaw has led to the decision today. Jason Carlow asked me, did I simply not know what was going on in my government? And here we get to the nub of it. I did not know what was going on in the investigation because the procedure said I shouldn't know what was going on in the investigation. I was informed by the investigation, yes, by Alex Salmond, but I did nothing to intervene in that process as a result of any of that. And that is, I think, an important point and one that I am very clear on. Lastly, in terms of does this make it more or less likely for complainants to come forward, I am absolutely clear that my responsibility and the government's responsibility is to make sure that we encourage, enable, empower people with complaints to come forward by putting in place robust procedures and by doing everything we can to make sure those processes are beyond reproach. If mistakes are made, as a mistake was made in this case, in good faith, but nevertheless a mistake was made, it is absolutely incumbent that lessons are learned in order that we can ensure collectively that we encourage anybody with a complaint to come forward and feel that that complaint is treated seriously and appropriately. Firstly, I am responsible for the Scottish Government, so I am standing here accountable to Parliament in the right and proper way. Notwithstanding in this case, because of the procedure, I was not personally involved in the conduct of the investigation, but nevertheless I absolutely accept my responsibility to answer these questions, and also now, given the error that has led to the situation we are in today, to make sure that appropriate steps are taken to learn and apply any lessons that are required. I've said already, I will say again, I deeply regret the position that two women have been placed in, and that is incumbent on not just me but the government in its entirety to make sure that we give confidence to women in future, that if they come forward with complaints, or not just women, if anybody comes forward with complaints, those complaints are treated seriously and the processes applied are robust. Part of that responsibility is to be clear, not to try to make excuses, but to be clear in fact of certain things and not allow those to be lost. The government has put in place a procedure that is robust in all bar one aspect, which of course is important because it has led to the situation we're in today. But in every other aspect, the government is confident that that procedure was applied correctly. In terms of the error that was made, the review that has been instructed today by the Permanent Secretary, I think it is important to allow that to happen and not to preempt any conclusions of that. But I will happily give an undertaking today to report back to Parliament on the outcome of that review and any steps that are being taken as a result of that. Finally, I think I said in my statement, the Permanent Secretary has spoken to the two women involved to apologise, to offer support. It will be open in the future for the Scottish Government, dependent on the views of the complainants, to reinvestigate these complaints, but of course that consideration has to await the conclusion of the police investigation. I understand the Permanent Secretary has spoken to or is speaking to in the course of today trade unions in order to give assurances there about how these complaints will be taken forward. I don't want anybody in this chamber to be in any doubt about how seriously I treat this situation. I think it is incredibly important that people have confidence in processes, and it is because of that that I feel so regretful at what has happened here today, and feel the responsibility, not just for what has happened, but to take whatever action is required to ensure that situations like this cannot happen again in future. And I will undertake to keep Parliament fully updated as that review takes place.
Willie Rennie.
What must be protected in the midst of all this heat is the rights of people to speak up. Big progress was made with the Me Too movement. It gave people who had been silent for so long the confidence that they would be heard. It is important that nothing today stops that, and this Parliament should stand together, should speak with one voice on that important issue. This is not a victory for anyone. I understand the civil service procedure was flawed, but does the First Minister agree that the police must be allowed to get on with their work free from political pressure?
Well, can I thank Willie Rennie for that question? I agree entirely with the sentiments and indeed the substance of it. I don't want to sound pedantic here. There's one point I feel it's important to stress, partly in the interest of what Willie Rennie is saying. The Scottish Government's procedure is not flawed. The application of that procedure in one respect we concede was flawed, and I know that perhaps sounds as if I'm nitpicking there, but I think it is an important distinction. Willie Rennie is absolutely right that I think a lot of progress has been made since the Me Too allegations came to light. Sometimes, and I'm not talking about this case, it feels as if with every step forward we sometimes take a step back in all of that. But it is really important that we all encourage and make people feel that they are able to come forward. And that's why I do regret so deeply what has unfolded today. I think Willie Rennie is right to say this is not a victory for anybody. This has no implications one way or the other for the substance of the complaints. And it is important for all of us to recognise that there is a police investigation underway, and it is incumbent on all of us to ensure that we don't say anything that may impinge on that investigation, and that investigation, in the interest of everybody concerned here, is allowed to properly take its course. I should say one of the, I don't know if this is the right word, it's the word I will use, one of the ironies of this is that it was the giving of support to the women that has led to this situation. The support that was given to the women before their complaints were formalised was entirely legitimate and appropriate. The problem was that the person, or one of the people, because not the only person, one of the people involved in the process of giving that support subsequently became the investigating officer, and that created the impression of partiality, although there is nothing to suggest actual partiality. So the women will be offered whatever support they need. In due course, as I've said a number of times now, the re-investigation of these complaints is an option, but that consideration requires to await the end of the police investigation.
And the First Minister made clear that the outcome of the decision today by the Court of Session is not an issue of guilt or innocence, but a matter of the process of handling a complaint not being properly carried out. And can she confirm that immediate and urgent steps are being taken to ensure that lessons have been learned and that staff can be confident of the procedures in place?
First Minister.
Well, as I said in my statement, not just this judicial review, but the lawyers amongst us in particular will know judicial reviews are not about the substance of issues, they are about the processes applied in a particular case, and that is the situation here. This judicial review, even had it not ended the way it ended today and had gone to the full hearing that was scheduled for next week, would never have been about the substance. So to use Stuart McMillan's language, this is not about guilt or innocence. What has happened today is regrettable. It's regrettable from the perspective of Alex Salmond as well as the complainants. Everybody involved had a right to expect that this process in all respects was robust. But there are other processes underway, as has already been acknowledged, and it's very important that those processes are allowed to take their course. Lastly, in terms of lessons learned, I've already mentioned the review that the Permanent Secretary has instructed. As I said to Richard Leonard, I'm not going to preempt what that might, the direction that might go in, but I will ensure that that is thorough, and I'll ensure that that happens as quickly as possible and that Parliament is kept fully updated.
Rhoda Grant, followed by Emma Harper.
There have been long-standing concerns about the Scottish Government's transparency We now know the First Minister has spoken to Alex Salmond on 5 separate occasions, none of which are referenced in her diaries. Can I ask if she will now make the content of these meetings public, and if not, why not?
First Minister.
The contacts I had with Alex Salmond, and I've set out the dates of these today, were not government meetings. I've known as a friend and colleague Alex Salmond for 30 years. He's not at this present time, but he was then a member of my party. People can make judgments on the decisions I took. One of the things I found out in the course of this, there's no manual for suddenly finding yourself dealing with a situation where somebody that you have worked with in that way is subject to these accusations. But I was very, very firm, and I have set out the first meeting, it was him informing me of the complaints. After that, he was making me aware of the concerns that he had about the process, and that he was proposing mediation and arbitration. At no point, and this is the key principle for me, I had no role in this process. I did not intervene or seek to intervene. Self-evidently, I didn't, because what he was seeking did not happen. And that is the important principle, and one that I am absolutely satisfied around. And I, today, not just on this issue, but on the more general issue, I'm anxious to be as transparent as possible within the confines of an ongoing investigation. And of course, as we move down and out of investigations, if there is more information that the government can make available to Parliament, then of course we will do so.
Paragraph 12 of the procedure explicitly provides for the involvement of the First Minister only when the outcome of the investigation is complete. That being so, why did the First Minister consider it appropriate to meet with Alex Salmond not once but 3 times, have 2 telephone calls whilst the investigation was ongoing?
First Minister.
I've set out a response to that already, but can I just make very clear, I was not involved in the procedure. I was not involved in any way in the procedure. I did not intervene in the procedure. I did not seek to intervene. I did not try to influence the course of the investigation. Had I done so, that would have been the subject of absolutely legitimate criticism. All of us reflect on decisions we take all of the time, and I'm sure that will be no different for me in this circumstance as it is on everything else. But I am absolutely satisfied that I acted appropriately and will continue to do so.